Welcome to the Ironcenturion podcast, a Christ-centered adventure into leadership, manliness, and brotherhood. It's good to see you, Michael.
You too, Tim.
Well, we just had our board meeting, which normally sounds like, a pretty boring subject and not something you'd want to listen to a podcast episode on. But when you start a ministry with your best buddies, those board meetings usually tend to be pretty fun.
Yes. One, board meetings are awesome at good organizations done well. And two, this episode isn't going to be about board meetings. So if anybody's panicking right now, you don't have to turn it off. But we did just have a board meeting. That's true. And there was a whole bunch of people there. We did some cool stuff and had some cool conversations. What were you specifically referencing? Well,
there are a lot of cool things coming up with the organization that we really talked about and got a chance to flesh out for the first time last weekend. So one of those things, and we'll roll these out slowly because I think each one of them kind of deserves its own segment. But one of the things that we started talking about is something called Legions. Now, Legions has been, I think we've mentioned it on the podcast one or two times before. Is that right?
Yeah, I think so. I remember we talked about it with Lance when he was here. We talked about goals.
Sure. Well, it's kind of been an underground project, one that we haven't really told very many people about. It's been a word of mouth thing. Started in Fort Worth right before the pandemic really got kicked off. So we've been doing this for going on 2 years now.
It was only supposed to be one, right? Like 1 year, right? As we kind of beta tested it, but then, stuff got in the way.
Yeah. The pandemic kind of changed up things radically. So we've been beta testing it for about 2 years now. And then we just opened another venue in Dallas, right? So we have a Fort Worth and a Dallas Legion that will be active this spring. And Michael, do you want to talk about what the plan is for that and what we're doing with Legions and why that might be of interest to some of our listeners?
Yeah, and we're looking at other cities across Texas or across the country, really. But the idea is that it's a once a month meetup for men where we're going to do three things every time. So once a month, we get together at a set aside location, spend about an hour and a half together and do three things every time. We spend about a half an hour doing some physical fitness stuff. So it's a group exercise, get the blood flowing a little bit. And then we spend some time learning and working on a manly skill. Let's see. What are some of the skills you've done recently, Tim, in Fort Worth?
We did Krav Maga. That was one of my favorite ones that we did. We've done some compass reading. We've done how to build like a vehicle, like safety kit. So we're getting stranded on the side of the road, those types of things. So,
okay. We did a emergency fire building. We did some water purification stuff. Anyway, so it's cool, manly survival skills, life type skills, very hands-on. And then the third thing that we do is we have a very special time of fellowship and prayer where we pray in either a large group or in small segment groups for other men that are there. And so there's an opportunity to build some community and connection. And I really like the way we do that prayer time. It's different than you might experience maybe other places. We've got some specific parameters and some kind of guardrails on that prayer time. Tim, do you want to describe that briefly? Because I think it's one of the things that's very unique.
Yeah, so that's been really cool, especially during the pandemic when churches weren't open. And that was one of the only times of fellowship that we could get together and be with one another on those Saturday mornings. So what we didn't want to have happen was guys to join together and offer up these milk toasty prayers for their Aunt Sally's cat that, has a paw amputated when, that happens on the regular.
It's very
specific. Yes. No, what we wanted guys to be praying for was how can they become the leader that God has called them to be? So if there is a certain thing that's in their way, that's being an obstacle, whether that's, a sin issue that's going on, or whether that's, a heart issue that's going on, or just a, wisdom that needs to be gained. What we're really looking for is to push men to look at what's holding them back from being the leader that God created them to be. And we'll be praying for those things intentionally. And that's kind of the main focus of what we're looking at during that prayer time.
Yeah, I found that to be really neat for the men that have been doing that with me. Is that we're not necessarily going to pray about, so and so that that has cancer. Not because we don't think God cares. We actually think he does care. But what we want to pray about is, how are you going to be engaged in that moment? How can you be salt and light, or a grace in that moment? So the prayer request always has to center back onto you, your development, what you're going to do differently, or because of this, that you're going to be the active agent that God and the Holy Spirit is going to work through, either in growing you or working in that scenario. And I've really liked that approach on prayer. Again, not because any other way of doing prayer is wrong, just that's the way we're specifically focusing for this time once a month.
Yeah, and it's not something that I feel like is done in other places either, right? So it's kind of filling a void to, you're dealing with some accountability stuff, you're dealing with, some calling up stuff, and it's just been a good prayer time, and it's really been challenging for the men that have been attending. So I've appreciated it.
Yeah. So what should we say about this Legions idea? We've got multiple places in Texas we're looking at having these, and one right now in each of the main cities of the DFW Metroplex. There'll be more information about them soon, right? What else should we say?
I would say pay attention to our Instagram. If you didn't know, we have an Instagram. We do. We'll be releasing more information about the cities that we'll be launching in the spring. And we'll probably have a whole separate podcast episode just dedicated to Legions and what we hope to accomplish through Legions, why we think you should be a part of one. So this is just kind of a heads up, let you know, maybe we should be planning to join one of these things coming up this spring, and something to invite your buddies to. But yeah, this is just kind of a general teaser for what some of our plans are this year.
I like it. Good. I'm excited.
So, Michael, you've got some things that we've been talking about over the last couple of months that I figured would be a good episode for a podcast, and we're finally going to get to sit down and do that. And that's talking about something called cybersecurity, a phrase that gets thrown out more and more these days as we spend more of our lives connected to the internet.
Yes.
So, Michael, let's talk about why is this an issue that is worthy of an entire episode of this podcast?
Yeah, this is already now going to be the nerdiest, geekiest podcast episode we've ever recorded, I think.
Second only to hobbies.
Hopefully that's a good thing. But this is just something I've become increasingly interested in and aware of, and done some work for myself on, and being able to track some of those impacts. And so I'll mention a little bit more about that, but it's clear in the digitally connected world that we're in that more and more and more companies, organizations, app creators are tracking our activity, our location. The things that we're doing are being tracked and cataloged and filed and put together in a meaningful way. I mean, in many cases, it is a marketer's dream to be able to know the data that now is available that we actually choose to give. And that's because I think that to us, those little bitty pieces of data individually are pretty meaningless. Where am I on a Monday morning at 10:30? Well, I'm generally at the same place on Monday mornings at 10:30. And to me, that's really insignificant. Everybody who knows me knows where I am. So why do I care if a company knows also? And I think in general, we don't. And that's the weird thing about it. I think maybe one of the best analogies that I've heard describing our accumulated data is that it's like guano.
How is that?
So guano is bat poop, right? And it actually is useless and meaningless to the bat. They don't care about it, but it piles up in the bottom of caves. And somebody a long time ago found that it had some commercial properties and they could use it to make stuff. It was very a key ingredient in dynamite for a while, for example. So the idea
did not know that, and I've blown up my fair share of dynamite. So.
I think it was kind of the early versions, right? But
good to know.
But the idea is that on its own, that individual bit of data is basically garbage. It's useless to us. But when all collected together, it has a harvestable value. And so companies are actively working to do that and to gather that stuff, because it allows them to ultimately turn more profits, understand customer bases and human flows and human behaviors and personalities way, way more than they could without it. And so it has a value to them, and to us, it may not seem to be valuable. But then it gets really scary and spooky when you let them collect a whole bunch of information about you, the stuff that they can start to discover and find out about you because of just these little bitty random, seemingly useless pieces of information. When you start to put them together, it can build a really interesting picture. And I'm just not sure I trust everybody out there to have that deep of a picture of who I am all the time, because my phone, which is internet connected, goes with me everywhere and tracks so many things that I do. And some of that just gives me a little bit of the heebie-jeebies. Doesn't it bother you some too?
Yeah, absolutely. And not because either of us are doing anything nefarious with our technology. And it's one of those things, like, just because you're not doing anything wrong doesn't give people the right to know exactly what you're doing.
Right. And that's the thing, right? As soon as you start talking about privacy, people say, well, what do you have to hide? And I don't know that that's how it works. I don't think that that's a legitimate response.
It's like, well, do you have blinds on your house? Do you want the neighbors to be able to look in your house anytime they walk by on the sidewalk and see what's going on? No, not because I'm trying to hide anything, but because they don't need to know everything that's going on inside my house.
I think that's a really good analogy. Yeah. That there's sometimes just some, I mean, there's a famous story, and this is even before the digital age fully, but there's a famous story about companies, specifically, interestingly, Target began doing some consumer behavior modeling. They hired a guy who was really good at numbers and really good at behavior and sociology and psychology. And they started doing these numbers on stuff to try to figure out, if somebody buys a product, product ABC, what other products are they also likely to buy, or what does it mean about them? And they got their models. This is before digital ability to track people with their phones was expanded to what it is today. They were able to figure out and begin target marketing to people individually. And they were able to figure out that certain combinations of things, they started sending ads for baby supplies and materials to a house, made this dad really angry. And he goes to the local branch of his Target, starts chewing out the manager, because he's like, why are you advertising to my teen daughter baby supplies? What are you trying to imply or do, or whatever? Turns out, long story short, is Target's models were so good that not only had Target figured out that this girl was pregnant before her dad knew, they had figured out she was pregnant before she knew. Because of how her behavior had modified, they were able to match it and start marketing to her. It was a really kind of amazing thing. The guy had to go back and apologize to the store manager, but it's an example that's old. I mean, it's before digital to the level we have today, and yet they could figure that kind of stuff out. That's pretty creepy, seems invasive, but human behavior patterns are repeatable and trackable. So the more data you have, the more personal stuff that seems like a huge leap is possible. And I just want to limit some of those things for myself.
So besides the Target, who else is interested in tracking what we're doing?
Well, I mean, of course, we have all the big tech names, right? I mean, we've got Facebook, Meta, whatever they are now. I mean, there was the big Cambridge Analytica thing that was a big news story about them that you can go look up. That was what it was all about. Google, of course, is tracking a lot of stuff. And then there's other advertising agencies and organizations that are tracking stuff. There's credit bureaus that are tracking things, just all of your buying and spending habits. On top of that, credit bureaus, they had a big breach. TransUnion had the big breach, right? And they leaked like more than half of all Americans' date of birth and social security numbers. And guess what? The two things about you that you can never change are your date of birth and your social security number. So for a lot of people, those are already out there. And so just being able to keep yourself protected from identity theft, from unnecessary tracking and privacy invasion is getting harder and harder and harder, especially when we seek the convenience that we gain by giving some new app access to everything on our phone.
So, at the risk of sounding like tinfoil hat wearers, I mean, at this point, there's really no way to get around the surveillance that's happening on you all the time, right? Like there's no way to completely remove yourself from this bubble unless you go live in a mountain in West Virginia somewhere and are completely off grid, right?
I know a guy who has no cell phone. He's not very digitally engaged. So, I mean, he'll never hear this episode, but he doesn't have a cell phone for some of these reasons. I think that's personally too far. That's not far as I want to go. I have a phone. I use it often. And I even don't lock down everything. So I use a lot of Google stuff. Run my email through Google. I know that I could pay for an email service and have that completely private. I know that Google's reading all of my email. That's a thing that I've decided currently I'm okay with. I may change my mind later. So you can get pretty extreme and lock down a bunch of stuff. I have taken some steps to lock down some things. And I thought that might be worth talking about because other people may want to decide where they fall on this spectrum and do some of these same things too, or none of these things. But
I think you can kind of equate this to physical security as well, right? So in the sense that when you walk down a street, you can choose what time of day you walk down that street. You might not do it at night. And if you do, you might not have, your finest gold jewelry on when you're walking down a street at night. In a certain neighborhood, right? So there are things that we can do to protect and take protective measures of our own physical security against theft, for example, when we are out and about in public. And this is kind of the digital equivalent of that, making yourself a more hardened target.
Yeah. And the thing that's tricky about that is in a dark alley, the boogeyman is easier to see or be aware of, right? It feels spooky. All the movies have told us it's spooky. But what, we don't see is the digital boogeyman in the same way until some type of event happens and there's some identity theft that occurs that's hard to clean up or something along those lines.
Or a conversation you have leads to an ad that shows up on your phone 20 minutes later.
Right. Or some type of data that you just don't want out about you or your family, et cetera, is now public news. And once it's public, the internet is permanent, right? So there's no such thing as something posted on the internet and then being taken down. It can be covered up in some cases or buried, but I mean, it always, once it hits the internet, it lives forever. And so it's permanent. And so there's some things that I just don't think should land there. Verizon made a big announcement about this. I think it was a big announcement. I don't know that they announced it very largely, but Wired magazine talked about it. Other places talked about it. Just in December of 2021, they announced that with the update of their app or their service, right? If you have their service for cell phone, they're going to be creating customer experience tracking accounts basically and track all mobile activity essentially for their customers to build profiles on them so that they can give them a better customer experience. Well, okay.
Sounds great, right?
It does sound good. And sometimes I like some of those things. I actually don't mind getting ads that are targeted to things that I might be interested in. That's kind of nice at times. It's much better than random ads like it used to be, where it just was interruption marketing and commercials on TV were random. But it's getting to the place now where commercials on TV are going to be more and more like the commercial that you see during your streaming show is not the same one that somebody else may be seeing when they're watching it. And it's going to be personally tailored. And all of those things are happening because of data that's being able to be collected. So they can show ads specifically to better target markets. From a marketing perspective, it gives them a better return on their investment. They get to hit the audience that they specifically want to talk to. The people that like outdoor adventure, for example, can see ads for hiking boots. And those who like motorcycle riding can see ads for motorcycle boots. And those that like running can see ads for running shoes, right? And so it can be very tailored. That's kind of nice. But sometimes those come at a hidden cost, I think, which is just maybe too much information being known about you. By the way, you can opt out of the Verizon thing. That was the whole deal about the news article, is that Verizon is going to be tracking everybody pretty heavily, but you have the opportunity to opt out. You just have to go into your settings if you have Verizon and choose to opt out.
And therein lies the big tech MO recently, right? It's like, we're going to make this small little announcement, and unless you know to go look for it, and unless you go look for this in 100 different places, throughout your day, then eventually there's going to be all these gotchas that, well, unknowingly you hit that accept button on the terms and conditions, and we added a few paragraphs that you probably weren't tracking before.
That's exactly right. And that's the play that Facebook has been doing for a long time.
Yep.
Because what they'll do occasionally is update your privacy setting options, and they'll change the way your privacy settings can work. And when they change that and update the app, you legally opt in when you say, yeah, I accept the terms and conditions. But what has changed is they've now opted you back in. That was the method they were using for the longest time. So you go in and say, I don't want you to know this. I don't want people to be able to look me up by my phone number. And you turn all those things off. And then they would change the way that menu set works and update the app every 6 months or so. And when they did, they'd opt you back in. And so you have to go in and opt out of all those individual things again. That's been pretty common. They're hoping that complacency, I think, allows them to gain some of the information they want.
And I think hoping based on very much research and data that proves that actually works. So.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, it works really, really well.
Yep.
Yeah. So here's what I thought we could do. We could talk through a few ways in a few different areas that if like, hey, I don't want this tracking. If the things that we've said so far have been scary to you, or just even slightly bothersome, or you might want to figure out how to cut back on some of the tracking and stuff that can happen. I just mentioned some ideas across a whole different spectrum, and you can pick and choose from some of those. This isn't really a how-to episode. Maybe it's more of a why to, and we've talked about some of the why to do this, but we can give some specific examples of some of the ways to limit some of the tracking up into the level that you're comfortable with. Because you can get really involved in this. You can actually start to spend money on it. It can become costly. Because remember, you've heard that old saying that if you're not paying for the product,
you are the product.
You are the product.
Yeah.
That's how that works with our data, right? So if you've got apps that are free and you're like, why is this app free? It's because not every single time, but almost every single time, they're just being able to suck a ton of information out of you that is worth it to them to make this expensive app and give it to you for free.
Yep.
And so sometimes turning off some of that tracking requires paying for things. And so that might be a threshold that you just say, you know what, I don't want to pay for anything. And that's fine.
There are options out there that will help.
There are. So here's one of the first ones that I suggest, and I did recently. It's kind of what launched me down this path. Is I just did an audit on my phone. I went into my phone. It's kind of deep, but I went into my security settings, and on my phone, and you can see by permission what apps have certain permissions. So I clicked on the show me all apps that have location permission. And it brought up 100 and something apps that all had location permission turned on. They could track me. Ideally, I think it's when the app is open, but I don't know that they're only doing that. And so I just went down that list and said, you know what? Here's an app that I haven't used in a year. Turn that one off. And you can just turn off the permission one by one right down this list. I have an Android. I'm sure it works similar on various versions of Android. And I think you can do some of the same stuff in iPhone. So I just turned them off by permission. I turned off who had access to contacts and location. And the thing is, when you turn that off, if that app later starts up and can't do now what it's supposed to do, it'll generally ask you and say, hey, I need permission to your location. I'm Google Maps, and I can't tell you how to get to work unless you give me access to your permission to your location. And so you can decide which ones you want turned on. I think I went from close to 100 that had access to my location to 30, maybe 25. When I was done with just that first level audit. And in that time, I also discovered some apps that I have that I just really didn't need anymore. And they had a lot of permissions. So I just, instead of just turning off the permissions, I just dumped the whole app altogether and said, you know what, this is not an app that I need.
Yep.
Tim, you told me about like a website or a tool that will help with this. It's like disconnect something.
Yeah. So this is a product I've been using for a long time. It's an extension you can get on Google Chrome. It might be available on other websites or other browsers as well, but it's disconnect.me. And really what that does is it stops a lot of the, let's see, I'm going to pull up the website here so I can not misquote. But essentially what it's doing is it's blocking the advertisers that are trying to view what you're doing. And it kind of creates a break in between them and whatever you're trying to look at online. So yeah, they claim that they're blocking malicious ads and content. They stop the tracking of your online activity and identity. It's really easy to use. All you have to do is download and install the extension into Google Chrome. And it makes websites faster because they're not adding all the behind the scenes things that are really just tracking your data as your websites are loading. So
yeah, that's actually something I noticed is my phone got a little bit faster after I did my audit and turned a bunch of stuff off. Yep. I noticed my battery lasted a little bit longer and my phone was more responsive because there was a whole bunch of background stuff that was taking up processing power and battery power that stopped. And that's actually one good way too to find apps that are doing something weird is you can check to see which apps are using your battery. And occasionally I'll see an app that's using not very much battery, but it's using battery, or you can use the same thing if you check to see which apps are using data. And you'll see like an app that you haven't opened in 2 months. It's using, a little bit of data every day. Well, that means it's sending or receiving something to its home servers. And if it's an app I'm not using, I don't know that I want it doing that anymore. And you can turn it off.
Right. The other thing is, asking the question of where is that app server? Where is that going? And specifically, what country is that going to? Because there's one that's overseas that loves to collect our data that I don't really like having any of my data.
Yeah, I actually have an example of that I was going to touch on a little bit later, but you're exactly
okay.
right.
Well, I won't steal it then.
No, it's okay, but good. Yeah, it's like where is the data going? That's a good question. If you want a good resource for a lot of this, I've found if you're on Reddit, there is a subreddit called Privacy Guides, where there's a whole bunch of people interested in privacy, and it's basically just an entire subreddit about privacy related stuff. And I found that to be interesting. Some of the people there are way further down the spectrum of wanting to lock stuff down than I am, but I've got my toes in the water on that further than I used to, and that has been a helpful resource for me. And then, Tim, you've actually been a helpful resource for this for me. In fact, it may have been one of the earliest things that I did is you suggested I change and upgrade the way I send text messages. The SMS text messaging system is a really bad system. And you turned me on to something that's been way better, and I use it exclusively now. Do you want to talk about that?
Yeah. So I've been using the Signal app for communications probably ever since 2018 is probably around the time I started using it. My day job gets, shall we say, hacked or hacking attempts on it on one of the highest levels of U.S. companies. So they know quite a lot about cybersecurity and those types of things. So one of the briefings that I got there at work was saying, hey, here's an app that we trust, that we think has a lot of security protections that you as our employee may want. And it's free. So that's always a big win. But essentially, the comparison would be an SMS message, which is a standard messaging protocol that your phone probably uses. It's very common in the United States and in Europe as well. But it's like sending a message in a bottle. So if I were to send you a text message, Michael, over SMS, my phone provider could read that message. The government could read that message. Anybody that intercepted that message could read that message without a whole lot of difficulty. And again, not because I have anything to hide in my messaging to Michael, but we know that the government is actively tracking the things that we're saying, and we have, feelings about that, whether that is overstepping their bounds constitutionally. So we turn to things like Signal and say, hey, look, I'm going to make myself a little bit harder of a target for you to just blatantly steal my data. So what Signal does is it has end-to-end message encryption, which means that Michael has a key and I have a key. And unless you have that key, your messages stay safe. Now, obviously, there's questions beyond that of, well, can I get past the encryption keys? And that's a whole nother conversation to be had. But for the most part, you're, again, making yourself a harder target than someone who's just sending an unencrypted message.
Right. So SMS is basically, and I know we don't use that term very much in the US. We just think of it as text messages, but texts are extremely unsecure. They're pretty much just an open message. So it's kind of like when you pass a note through class, right? If you're in school in a classroom and you write a note and you put on the top of it, hey, hand this to Tim, and then you hand it to somebody else. They look at it and they read it and they go, oh, give this to Tim. But they could read the whole message if they want to, and they pass to the next person. Anybody who wants to can read it. This is different. And yeah, you're right. We're not talking about all the super levels of encryption and how to get it, are they crackable or not? The idea here is just to be a slightly more difficult to intercept or to crack individual than the masses, because the hackers have plenty of time. If it's hackers involved or if it's just data collectors involved, they have plenty to do with all of the easy to access data. So if you're just slightly harder, they'll just pass on your information because it's not worth the time and energy it would take to get to it. So I used to use WhatsApp for this. WhatsApp was end-to-end encrypted and a great group messaging tool. And then WhatsApp was bought by Facebook, and that made me unhappy. And so you told me about Signal, and I switched from WhatsApp to Signal, and I'm excited about that.
Yeah. So a lot of people, WhatsApp was one of the first encrypted messaging systems, and it's hugely popular in Europe.
Yes. And Asia,
overseas
actually.
in general. Yeah.
Yep.
Because of that encryption technology. Now, like you said, the downside is that Facebook now owns that. And if you trust Facebook one iota, you probably trust them way too much. So yeah, I have no qualms about ditching WhatsApp, because I don't trust Facebook at all. Yep. So we're going to post, we have an image here of what the different encrypted messaging systems will take from your phone. Facebook, WhatsApp, Telegram, and Signal. And what they're storing data-wise on you. Spoiler alert, the one from Facebook is the longest list of things that they are taking from you.
It's a really scary list, actually.
The next longest list is WhatsApp. A shorter list is Telegram. Telegram takes your contact info, your contacts, and your user ID, and they store that on their own servers. Signal, however, takes none of that. All the data is kept locally to your phone and to the recipient's phone. None of it is stored on any of their servers. So, say one of the government agencies said, "Hey, we're doing an audit. We want you to hand over all your records on so and so." They don't have anything because they're just they help facilitate the transmission. That's it.
Yeah, and this isn't always the case, but one of the things I like about Signal is that they are a not-for-profit organization with a open source code. So like anyone who knows how to read code, I don't, but anyone who does can go and read the code and see what they're doing, which allows it to be pretty easily audited to say, are they actually doing what they're said they're going to be doing?
Right.
So it's open source. That doesn't always mean trustworthy. There can be bad open source stuff, and there can be really good closed source stuff. In theory, you just wouldn't know for sure. And so I really like the way Signal is currently set up. I've been using it since you told me about it.
They've been verified by other third parties. And, again, to have a company of my company's caliber that is vouching for this and saying, yeah, this is what you should be using for your personal protection, I think that goes a long way in and of itself.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's gotten to the point where I think 80% of my messaging, I converted enough of my friends so that 80% of my messages are encrypted end to end rather than over SMS. So if you're one of those 20% that I contact on the regular and you listen to the podcast, please know that it does bother me when you send me an SMS message.
I will say too, if you're on Android, Signal doesn't work quite the same on iPhone. It's still great, but if you're on Android, it's amazing because you can make it your default messaging center, and it will send SMS messages to anyone who's a recipient that isn't a Signal user. So you have a seamless experience. You still just are sending messages like you normally do. It tells you if you're sending a secure one or an unsecure one, but that way, all messaging for me comes right in and out of Signal. It's the only messaging app that I have and use now regularly. But
see, this for me would be like if I had an iPhone, this would be the big enough switching point for me to say I'm done with iPhone. I'm just going to use Android because of how integrated the messaging can be on an Android platform.
Yeah, it's a big reason. I think I agree. I agree. I mean, I personally do think Android's better than the iOS systems
all day long.
And this is one of the reasons. Privacy in general is I think one of the reasons. You can be much more private if you choose to be on Android than I think that you can be within Apple's universe.
Is Apple interested in your data?
I would think that they are.
Interesting.
So speaking of data, another big thing that comes up, right? And if you've watched anything on YouTube over the last 2 or 3 years, somewhere along the way, you've run into a video that had an ad or was sponsored by a VPN provider. And so a VPN is a virtual private network. Some people have to use ones for their work that they do, but you can get one personally and use a VPN yourself at your house. And so I think about VPNs, but the interesting thing about VPNs is I don't know that they do what some people think they do. I used to think that VPNs like anonymized all of your data, and so that anything that you are doing on the internet is now like scrambled and hidden, and nobody knows what you're doing.
Like the ultimate incognito mode. Right.
And it's not that at all. It's not that VPNs are bad. It's just that's not what they do. Basically, your internet service provider, your ISP, which is going to be like Spectrum or Verizon or AT&T or whoever you pay your monthly internet bill to, they can see every internet piece of activity that you engage in. They can see all of it because they're the ones like literally feeding up those websites when you ask for them. What a VPN does is it basically just moves who you trust. In the simplest form, it moves it from being where your ISP can see it to now your VPN provider can see it. And so if you're going to choose to do some type of whole home or a VPN setup, what you really want to make sure you do is get one where the terms of service are hopefully followed by them and where they're saying, look, even though we can see your traffic, we don't care, we don't log it, we don't track it, we just don't care. That's what you think you're getting, but not all VPNs operate that way. That's actually deterred me a little bit from setting up a VPN because you're really just moving who you trust to be able to see everything from your ISP to your VPN. I probably will end up doing it at some point. I just haven't yet. And that's one of the reasons is it doesn't scramble everything. They can still see all of it. And every website that you are visiting, they still know that you're asking to see their website because they've got to send the data out to you.
With some side perks, however, I might add that if you want to watch a European version of Netflix that has different shows on it than we do, a VPN will help you do that.
Yes. Yeah. So you can switch your location. That's true. There are, I'm not downplaying VPNs. I'm saying you need to make sure you get one you trust if you're going to do that. There's a ton of them and some of them aren't very good. And then you just need to know like really what you're doing. You're just moving you're handing the baton of who you trust to someone else. Probably is better though, because probably shouldn't trust your ISP. Of course, I say that, and I haven't changed. I haven't set up a VPN yet myself. So, when it comes to browsers, there's some internet browsers and search engines that are better than others. Google, of course, is the biggest and best one from a finding things perspective, but the reason it's the best is because it tracks what everybody's searching for, so it knows what to show people. Yeah,
I mean, if you go back to like the early days of the internet, we had so many options for searches. Ask Jeeves, yes. Yahoo, people actually use that.
Yep. There were several others that I've just completely forgotten because who needs those anymore?
Yeah, every once, occasionally this Google character kept popping up like, oh, they seem to have their act together. It's a nice, clean looking search bar, and generally got me to the websites that I was looking for. And then all of a sudden, they dominated and wiped out the competition to where to search for something on the internet is synonymous with Googling it.
Yes. Yep. Yep.
But what are some of the other ways now that we can search for things that don't involve directly going through Google?
Well, the biggest one, I mean, they even have billboards. Have you seen any of the billboards for this one? I've seen billboards around Dallas.
Yeah.
Okay. So DuckDuckGo has a bunch of big claim to fame for them is they don't try in any way to identify who you are, create a profile for you. They create a session when you're searching. They'll be able to keep your history of that search, so you can hit the back button and it works. But as soon as you close that search session, it's all gone. They don't keep track of it. At least this is what they say they do. They don't try to identify you or keep track of it with you, building profiles on you. It's a once and done thing. And so they're big right now on privacy. And as in general, I think the culture has moved to a little bit more awareness around privacy. That's why I think we're seeing their billboards and stuff around places. Yep. But here's the thing. You can switch over and start using DuckDuckGo as your search engine. It's in some cases just not as good because it doesn't have the advantage that Google has, and it doesn't know me, right? So when I come back and create a new session, there's no history there. I can't remember, sometimes it's helpful for me with Google. I'll start searching something to find what I saw before, right? It'll pop up and say, hey, do you mean this that you searched for before? And I'm like, yes, thank you. That's what I was looking for.
A recipe that I tried 4 or 5 months ago. I was like, that was really good. I want to do that again.
Right. You can't do that with DuckDuckGo. If you don't keep it, or any other browser that's really not keeping your history, it's gone. When you close the session, it's over, and all of it is over with. And so that's one of the downsides that's been, we've got to figure out how to overcome that, or you have to decide how you're going to overcome that if you want to move away from letting Google or Microsoft's Bing or Yahoo search keep all of the things you're looking for and when you're looking for them, from what IP address and all those kind of things that they can figure out, what time of day, all that goes into creating a profile.
So, Michael, I think we should probably just pull the rabbit out of the hat here, because you undertook quite the project last year, and you built something rather unusual, shall we say, into your home cybersecurity protection.
It is a little unusual.
Why don't you talk about that? Because it's been quite the topic of conversation on our Triari group chat with our staff members, but
in our Signal group, right?
Yes, in our Signal group.
Yeah. So I decided to build my own home router to process all of the internet that's coming into my house according to the set of rules that I create and set and manage. And so let me say a couple things here. One, I learned a ton from this project. This was kind of a bit of a COVID project. I don't know much about coding, but I had to learn some. I got an old computer off of eBay. I think that's where, for like $100 or $150 all in, made some adjustments to it. And so now I have my own routing system. So let me explain this by giving a couple definitions. There are 3 pieces of your internet puzzle at your house. And I'm not going to go into too much depth. This isn't a how-to. We can link to some. But essentially, you have these 3. The first one is a modem. It's something that translates the signal that's coming from your internet service provider, probably throttles it because you're not paying for their full speed, whatever, and turns it into something that you can use. That's a device that they have to provide to you. And in many cases, for some people, that's an all-in-one device, and it does everything. Or maybe you have that modem plugged into a router that you bought off the store from a tech supply store. That's okay. Here's the thing, though. There's 3 devices. There's a modem that you need. There's a router that literally routes traffic. It's like the policeman at the corner holding his hand up and telling traffic when they can go where. And then you need an access point if you want to have wireless internet. So you need some way for your phone, your laptop to connect to the internet wirelessly. Those 3 devices or those 3 projects are needing to be done for you to have Wi-Fi at your house. The problem is the all-in-one things that are provided to you by your internet service provider or the one you buy at the store, which typically if you buy it at the store, you're just getting the router and the access point. But when it's all bundled together, it really does a really bad job. It's much, much better to have one device for each of these jobs. They can do them really, really well. And that's why in commercial environments, you don't see like routers hanging on the ceiling. You see those little round devices or something that are the antenna, the access points for internet. And then those are hardwired back to a set of server routers, even for like a big hotel or a restaurant or something like that. They don't just have a off-the-shelf device sitting in the back somewhere. And that's because it's better to break these jobs up individually. And so I did. So I built my own router out of an old computer, and it just does traffic and firewall stuff. And I used a piece of open source software. It's called Pfsense, and we'll put a link to that in the show notes too if you want to do something like this. But it's commercial grade, but it's open source. There is an upgraded premium version you can pay for, but it's software you install locally on your computer and you use it to run as a server for your home. And so I now have access to a lot of features that good routers should have, but the off-the-shelf box routers typically don't.
So what are some of those things? I mean, are we talking things like parental controls, for example, if you're a parent?
Yes.
On what types of websites can get through?
Yep. So parental controls, or even just for personal controls. So you can control things like which categories of websites are accessible on your network. You can even say which types of websites are available at certain times of day. So if you don't want your kids, for example, wasting time on YouTube when they're supposed to be doing their homework, you can set up certain parameters like that if you want. You can also set up a firewall that keeps stuff from coming in to your home network. So I referenced this earlier, stuff that can phone home. There are several devices that we often buy, bring into our homes and connect to our network that are notoriously insecure. Security cameras are very, very common, and almost all of those are made overseas in a country that is very interested in all of the things that we do. And almost every security camera phones home pretty regularly. And it's interesting and one curious why. In fact, so often, what was the company? Hikvision. They're made in China, and the US Department of Defense made a big statement and said, no more can these be used on any US government facilities. And it was a big deal because they make like many of the security cameras that are commercially available. So it was a big deal. Do you remember that story? Was that like a year ago, 2 years ago?
Yeah, probably about 2 years ago at this point.
So those things will reach out and phone out. And so what you can do with this router that I have now is I can segment Internet of Things type devices. Another great example of a problematic one is your home printer. If you connect it to your Wi-Fi, if those get full access, not just to your home network, but to the entire internet, they are sending and receiving stuff often, maybe stuff you don't want to be sending and receiving. And so I can now create a home network that is wireless, but devices on it don't have any access to the big, broader internet. And if you're going to put in security cameras, in my opinion, you don't want them to have any access to the internet at all. They should never be able to talk to the internet without you giving them approval.
Tell us about the ads, because that was an interesting thing that
yes,
most people would probably be interested in.
So I don't like a lot of ads. I said earlier that I don't mind being targeted specific with ads of things that are interesting to me, but I just don't like a lot of ads. So another thing that I was able to do with this router is it has a plugin that you could add to it that will block at an entire network level most advertisements. So that means any device connected to my Wi-Fi. So even if you come over as a guest or my laptop, my phone, all those things, probably 80% of the ads are diverted before they arrive at my device, which means what's happening actually is my router is going, you're an ad. You go to this computer over here. That happens to be the computer that's the router that doesn't have a monitor hooked up and no one's ever looking at. So the ad displays there for no one to see. And my device, my phone, is ad-free or uninterrupted by ads. In fact, I forget sometimes how well it works until I leave my house and I'm out like at the office or I'm doing stuff and I'm just like, man, there's so many ads. I'm like, that's right. That's what the normal world is like. I forgot.
So does that stop YouTube ads? Because those are my absolute nemesis. I hate YouTube ads.
Unfortunately, no, it doesn't stop any advertisements that are coming from the exact same domain that that you're trying to visit. And the way YouTube serves their ads, it doesn't stop YouTube ads. But most ads are delivered from a separate server. So there's multiple, like when you go to a website, you're actually not just pinging one server, you're probably pinging 20 or 30 at once. And so to make it faster, they put small pieces of different things, different places. And typically the ads are served from a different location and it knows to route those somewhere else. The cool thing is I'm not rejecting those ads. So the website or whatever I'm on isn't getting the message that this ad was rejected and not displayed. They get a confirmation that it seemed to have gone through properly. I just don't see it. It's nice.
So you don't run into any issues with, like, some websites hate ad blockers and say, hey, you've got to turn this off to access XYZ feature.
because I'm not blocking the ads. I'm just redirecting, I'm splitting them, and they're going.
Just putting them in the closet.
Yeah, they're going somewhere else.
Very cool.
Yeah. So that's been a nice feature. Here's another feature that I think is neat is I can now see more information and more data. And so I can see, imagine your Wi-Fi is like your house. The Wi-Fi for your house is like your house. But you've got a bunch of different IP addresses potentially at your address. And so there are data collecting servers out there in the world that have various forms of intents that will just actively knock on different IP addresses. They'll just say, hey, anybody here? Knock, knock. Kind of like somebody prowling around your house and checking to see if your door's locked and peering in the windows and seeing if you locked the window because they want to see if they can get in and learn some stuff. They may not have terrible intents, but I don't want them coming in. And I'd like to know that they aren't coming in. Probably your router that you bought from wherever store, it's probably doing that. But how often is it getting its firewall rules updated? Is it ever getting them updated? Can you force a new update? Can you see that traffic? You probably can't on most routers. I can. And so, Tim, are you ready for this?
I'm ready.
Okay, I just pulled mine up to see. In the last, so I have rejected knocks on the doors or peering in the windows, 10,704 knocks that originated from the country of Russia in the last 24 hours.
That's a couple.
Yeah. And there's also more from the US and other countries down the list. China's on this list. Surprise, surprise. Others are on this list. These are knocks on my house I didn't ask for. It's not me pinging a website and saying, hey, send me data. This is just servers going out there and saying, hey, they're just crawling the internet as a whole, saying anything open here, anything I can get in, can I see, can I check this? And I am rejecting them. And now I can track them by geographic location. And so I've done 10,000 no's. No thanks, please. We don't want any of you here right now. 10,704 just from Russia. Are they all originating from Russia? Probably not. Any good computer hacker or data collection person knows right now that you just funnel it to make it look like you're coming from Russia. That's probably the best place to show up from.
But at the same time, it's not like they really have to hide because who is looking?
Right. Who's looking? I know this. I bet most people don't know this about their home. Like, do you have any idea how many times Russia has knocked on the network at your house?
No idea.
Yeah. Who knows that? I now know. It's a little scary, but I now know. And that's kind of cool to be able to keep track of and see that. So that's given me, I think it's given me more peace of mind. I mean, before I was just blissfully unaware, and you know what they say about ignorance being blissful. So I was, now I'm not. But the thing is, I'm not special. This is happening to every single network, whether it's your home or your work network, everywhere. Like they're knocking on the doors of all of those all the time.
It's very true.
Yeah.
So let's, there's one last thing we wanted to talk about, and that was passwords, right? So what are some things that we can do to write better passwords, right? Because ever since passwords began, and I remember having as a small child to create a password, and most of those passwords have stayed the same through my adult life because I'm just bad at generating passwords. Sure.
So it's the most common password in the world is password. And
I'm not that bad.
Okay, good. It's a surprisingly high number of passwords. Also, the most common set of 4 numbers is literally just 1, 2, 3, 4. If you add a 5th number, it's 5. I mean, it's just amazing. Clever. Yep. I remember getting interested in passwords and password cryptography, like in high school in the early days of some of the internet and computers. And I was interested in how some of those tools work. And there were tools literally where you would build a library of stuff and you just put in a whole bunch of words and access a dictionary. And then it could go and what's called brute forcing a password, where it would try every possible set of passwords computerized very, very, very fast. And watching some of those things work, it's kind of like in the movies when somebody's trying to hack into something, right? Which is trying a bunch of the potential options. And all of those dictionaries that you could download always had password, password 1234, and password 123, and password exclamation point as like those were default in like every dictionary. And they're still the most common password. It's insane. So here's the thing. Your passwords are probably garbage. The password that you've probably created it so it's easy for you to remember. Easy to remember means non-complicated, and that means easy to crack. Also, you probably reuse your passwords in a lot of places. So your password for Netflix is maybe your password for Gmail, which is maybe your password for Facebook, which is maybe your password for your bank. And here's why that's a problem. The problem is the moment one of those has a data breach and your passwords are stolen, hopefully your passwords are stolen in some encrypted format, not just plain text format. But even if they're encrypted, if they're simple enough, and if enough people have used like the password, they can figure out, hackers can figure out what type of encryption that website was using to lock down those passwords, and they can start cracking more and more and more passwords. And so
it's a happy thought.
It is a happy thought. So if your password is jeopardized somewhere, they go, Tim's password is password 1234. And we now have his email address or his username. Let's go to every major website in the world and try that username and password combination. Because guess what? Maybe he reused it because he probably reuses his password over and over and over. And so they go and try your Netflix and Facebook and your Gmail account. And they're just trying all of those with the password they got from that one random website that you set up that one time that you don't really care about, that doesn't have very good security, but you use the same password. And so now you're jeopardized. So the best solution is to use one website. One website gets one password. So if it gets hacked into somehow, their database gets breached, they just have the password to that website and it won't work anywhere else. But man, I've got, 200 websites I've got passwords for. How do I memorize 200 passwords?
Without the inconvenience of I forgot my password every time I have to go to the website.
Right. And then you got to do those. And then, the most frustrating thing of those forgot my passwords things, right, is when you're resetting it and you can't get in, you can't log in. So you click the I forgot and you reset the password and you put in what you want the password to be. And it pops up and says, your password can't be your last password. And you're like, dang it. I knew that. I was trying that. Why wouldn't it work? So what I do instead, and this is easy, lots of ways to do this, but there are password keepers, password trackers. There is LastPass, there is Dashlane, there is Bitwarden. Bitwarden's the one I use. It is a free open source password tracking technology. Because it's free and open source and nonprofit-y, it's not as spiffy and pretty as like LastPass or Dashlane that you pay for, but it allows some really cool features. One, I don't know the password that I use for almost any of my websites. I don't know my password. The only password I know is my Bitwarden password, and it's very difficult. It knows all my other passwords. And so it's got
also very difficult, not human readable. They're
just really complicated, like 26 or 32 characters with like all of the special characters available. And it's just very complicated. It'd be very annoying to have to type those. It's like a big hash key. And I've got the Bitwarden app on my phone. So now I log into Bitwarden and then it can log me into any website that I want. And it generates the new passwords when I need them. And so I've got one password for every website.
So why would you use something like this and not, for example, Google Chrome, which also volunteers to store your passwords and credit card numbers?
Sure. And it will. I like trusting something specific that is designed for this purpose over the convenient features built within the browser. I feel like the browser has built them with a goal for convenience and not as much of a goal of significant security. And so I'm just concerned personally that the Google Password Vault may get cracked eventually or messed up, or maybe you can accidentally leave it logged in. I've seen that happen before. You say, hey, can I borrow your laptop? And somebody lets you borrow their laptop and it's logged, like all their passwords and information are stored. And so you can go anywhere you want to as them. I've even seen that happen before. I was at like a library or an internet cafe and Google had been storing people's passwords And people had been saying yes. And so there was like a whole bunch of usernames and logins stored in the password keeper on this publicly available computer. So I just like, as a general rule, not doing that. And all of these like Dashlane or LastPass or Bitwarden will allow you to share your password with other people. So my wife and I have a shared family password set, so that the joint type of accounts that we use, like Netflix, we can both see the password to that. We can both use the password to that. If one of us needs to reset it, it gets saved in there as the new password. And my wife maybe never knows that I reset the Netflix password because it still just works like it did before.
That's really handy.
Yeah. So I'm a big fan of that. It makes very hard passwords, because again, the goal here is to make your password slightly harder to crack than everybody else's in the database. So everybody else is using password or something really simple, like an easy to remember word with an exclamation point. Mine is harder because mine is 26 characters long and includes the whole keyboard array of options. So is it hackable through a brute force attack? Yeah, eventually, but they're going to get like everyone else first, and they're just not going to care about the 1 or 2% they probably can't get. And hopefully I'm in that pool of people.
Again, going back to that hardened target type of mentality,
right?
Just be more difficult than the next guy.
Yeah. So just, make your car with the one with the windows up and the alarm set, and the guy with the windows down and no alarm is going to be the one whose backpack gets grabbed out of the back seat, right? Because it's easy. I'm just going to try to make mine slightly harder than the average, and that provides a tremendous amount of security.
Yep.
Well, okay, look, so here's the thing. I said this wasn't going to be a how-to. It also is a little bit nerdy, and some people might be reading this right or listening to it right now going, this is like way beyond anything that they want to worry about and do. Okay, fine. I'm not advocating that you have to do that. Some people may go, haha, that's so cute, Michael. I have my own, and then they go through their own list of whatever they've done. It's way, way, way beyond me. That's fine too. I just think we should become increasingly aware of privacy and security. It's an eye-opener to know that nearly 11,000 times every 24 hours, some server from Russia is trying to access my home network. And I don't do anything worthy of discovery. So that means they're doing that to every network. It's good to know that kind of stuff and have some safeguards in place.
And I think, the question that might be in some of our listeners' heads right now is like the so what, right? Like, you guys are a Christian's men's ministry. Why do you care about internet privacy? To those people, here's my response. And this could be an episode in and of itself, so I probably won't go into a whole lot of detail because we're running a little bit long as it is. But if you go back to the Constitution, if you go back to some of the founding documents of our country, those men, even though I understand not all of them were believers, they all had a shared Judeo-Christian mindset. And those values of life and liberty, they came from somewhere, and that somewhere is the Bible. The undercurrents of all these founding documents that had initially promised us what they did not have coming from England. And, a lot of those same violations of security, many of them were obviously happening in a much different realm than a digital infringement of those rights. But nonetheless, they are things that we hold dear as Americans, and largely because of the truth that's found in Scripture. So again, this is a whole nother, subject and conversation, but it's one of the reasons that we do care about it. We do feel like the Lord has given us kind of this right to pursue privacy, because He created all of us uniquely and specially. And yeah, that's a whole nother episode. I don't want to get too deep into that rabbit trail. But that's a 2 cents on why we think this matters from a biblical perspective.
Yeah, and I think essentially there's a lot of controls that you can do, right? You can use some of the tools I mentioned to block certain websites or block them at certain times. There's just a lot of things that can provide some benefits around this. Well, one of the next steps that I'm going to work on doing is being able to set up so that my phone can VPN to my home network from anywhere. And in fact, I'll then probably leave that on all the time, which means my phone always thinks it's at my home network, which means the ad blocking that I've set up will work, but I can also access all the stuff at home. I'll still have full internet. My phone is just first going to my house through the servers that I've built up before it goes to the internet. And that provides some security and some features, allows me to see cameras, for example, at home without the cameras having connection to the internet, because I'm going to tunnel back into them instead of the other way around. Lots of stuff like that. The idea is that just because you're seeking privacy isn't because you're saying I have something to hide. I think there's some knowledge that can be gained. I also enjoyed it just intellectually as a hobby, learning more about how does networking and network stuff work. And I just have scratched the surface. So I probably caused somebody who knows more about this than me to pull their hair out a little bit. And for that, I apologize. My goal was to raise some awareness, not to be always perfectly correct on all the technical stuff. So I'm going to put as many links in the description below. If you're like, hey, I want to try this one thing. My passwords are terrible. I want to fix them. Or I want to know more about that home router system. I'm going to put as many links as I can to tools and systems so that you can find information about that. I'll put some how-to YouTube videos up there. And then send us an email at podcast@ironcenturion.org. If you've got questions, I'm not promising to be your tech support, but I can maybe clarify something that I said wrong or something. You can send us an email and I can try to point you in the right direction.
That sounds good.
All right. So thanks for joining us on this episode of the Ironcenturion podcast, a Christ-centered adventure into leadership, manliness, and brotherhood.
We'll see you later.
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Ironcenturion podcast. We're thankful for the support of listeners like you who support this podcast through donations. If you'd like to be a part of our support team, please visit ironcenturion.org/donate. For more information on what it means to be a leader for Christ or how you can get involved, check out ironcenturion.org.